Come along with me, misery loves company. You'll find me at the home of the blues. I said you'll find me at the home of the blues. What's up, everybody? Doing a quick topic today on how I got into watches, how I started wearing watches, how I started collecting watches, so forth and so on. Watch I'm wearing today is a Longines Olympian automatic 508 caliber movement, I believe. Old school vintage watch with perfect condition. Dial is pristine, crystal is very pristine, everything about this watch is pristine. I got it for $300 from a charity shop, some sort of Catholic charity shop. So all the money that they make off of the sales goes towards like the church or helping the hungry or something like that. Anyway, good price for what it is. Pristine condition Longines for $300 is a steal. Anyway, let's get into the tale. It all started off with my mother getting me a crappy Scooby-Doo watch. This was when I was very young. And these watches were sort of popular among kids at the time. You know, they were all made in China, probably by the same manufacturer, but they came in different themes. They were all quartz, by the way, anyway. They were just shitty plastic material. Like, you could smack something and it'll crack and shatter, and it was pretty hilarious, but they were popular at the time. They were trendy among kids. You know, you had Batman theme, you had Superman, you had Rugrats, you had Goosebumps, which was a very popular book series and TV series and movie series at the time. And you had, you know, Rugrats, you had Barney, whatever. You had all these themes of these watches, right? And the one my mother got me was a Scooby-Doo one. And Scooby-Doo was kind of lame at the time, you know? Like, nobody really cared too much about Scooby-Doo anymore. You know, it was all about the new cartoons. Rugrats, Hey Arnold, whatever. Scooby-Doo was kind of old school, you know? So I kind of felt lame, you know? I saw all these other kids wearing Pokemon watches and Digimon watches and whatever, and here I'm stuck with a stupid Scooby-Doo watch. It was like this bright, I don't want to say neon green, but it was a bright green, just rubber, uncomfortable strap, and the strap wasn't a removable strap. It was all like one piece. The watch was all one piece. Plastic crystal, quartz movement, just plastic. Actually, the whole body of the watch was plastic. It was all plastic. So, you know, through my adventures, I don't remember what happened. I found it very uncomfortable to begin with, but through my adventures as a kid, you know, you're going to run around, you're going to fall, you're going to smash into things, you're going to punch things, you're going to throw rocks, you're going to get hit by rocks, whatever. That watch did not survive long. I think I smashed it or something happened along those lines. And, you know, I stopped wearing watches. But that watch gave me a specific feeling. It made me feel a little bit more grown up. You know, like, oh, I have a watch now. You know, that means, you know, I gotta take care of my time, whatever, you know. So it definitely made me feel more grown up. But, you know, I stopped wearing watches for a long time, up until probably 7th or 8th grade in grammar school, and then transitioning into high school. Around 7th, 8th grade, one of my cousins got a job at Seiko, like a brick and mortar Seiko store at the mall. And, you know, he didn't want to admit it, but I know that it's true, that like the more watches that he sold, he was paid extra commission. So he never admitted, but I know this to be true because he purposely pushed certain watches onto certain people. Like if he had family coming in there, like he always pushed like the weird quartz watches that nobody wanted to buy. Like especially men's quartz watches were not ever sort of popular among watch enthusiasts. You know, like a regular person, they go into Seiko, oh yeah, I want to watch on batteries. They get a quartz, they don't really care. You know, but I know for a fact that quartz watches sell less than automatic watches. And he's a bastard for doing this because he pushed many quartz watches onto me. And he's like, oh yeah, you know, don't worry about it. you come back here, I'll change the battery for free. The battery change was like what, $5 or $10, whatever. Yeah, I'll change the battery for free, whatever, whatever. These watches were like $100 a piece, and he pushed these shitty quartz watches onto me that nobody wanted to buy, so he could get commission from it. And instead of turning me on to automatic watches, which would be ideal because automatic watches are what, $60, $70 more expensive, but that would really get me into watches because the automatic complications, the automatic features, just the feel and the look of automatic watches are different. And me knowing that it has a sweeping seconds dial instead of like a ticking movement, like it would spark that collector's interest in my brain. But he did not do that. He was in it for the profit, as many people are. So I was kind of stuck with these quartz Seiko. I think I have like 2 or 3 quartz Seiko watches throughout 7th, 8th grade and throughout all of high school. I wore Seiko quartz watches. And then it wasn't really that big of a deal to me, it's like whether I was wearing a watch or not, it's like meh, it wasn't a hobby, it wasn't a thing, it wasn't trendy either. Like if you had like a regular watch, girls really didn't pay attention. At the time that I was going into, 7th, 8th grade and then later on high school, G-Shock, you had to have G-Shocks to catch females' attention, and even girls wore G-Shocks as well. So it was trendy and it was cool at the time. So after high school kind of finished, I stopped wearing watches. You know why? I got into college, and it was kind of a nerdy. It gave off a sort of a nerdy, geeky vibe. A lot of people were getting these Apple watches at the time, and everybody had their iPods and their iPhones, and nobody really used watches anymore. And especially to women, like in the college atmosphere, I feel that you kind of resonated this sort of nerdy, geeky kind of vibe if you wore a watch, unless it was something like an Apple Watch. Then you were cool. But otherwise, I feel it kind of took down from your style points and your attractive points. Okay, so in college, I didn't wear a watch at all. I just checked my time on my phone, on my iPod, whatever. And then later on, as I grew older, whatever, I wanted to become more sophisticated. I didn't give a fuck what anybody thought about me. I wanted to become more sophisticated, I wanted to become more dapper, and I wanted to become a gentleman, right? And what do gentlemen have? What's the one thing that, like, you think of as gentlemanly, right? Watches. James Bond with the Rolex, with the Omegas. James Dean wore pretty nice watches. Not all the time, but he did wear watches. And you look at all these cool figures in history, and they all wore, watches. FDR wore Franklin D. Roosevelt wore a Movado triple calendar, I believe. That's a very expensive watch at the time and a very nice watch by today's standards anyway. I want to own them. But you look at all these cool people, right? You look at all these high class people, and they have one thing in common. They all wear expensive watches. And what's the one name that comes to your head when you think of expensive watches? Rolex, right? Rolex. So I made it a mission. I started wearing, dapper clothing, started, my employment anyway required me to wear dapper clothing. But I enjoyed wearing that clothing. Whereas a lot of people dread wearing that clothing when they're employed or whatever in their jobs, I actually enjoyed wearing that type of clothing to my jobs or whatever. And I made it a mission to get that Rolex. It had to be a Rolex, but I started off looking into other brands. I looked into Omega, and if memory serves me right, it wasn't too long ago, but my memory's pretty shitty. My first sort of luxury watch was a vintage Omega Seamaster 1020 caliber day-date feature. And I felt great. That watch made me feel high class, even though it probably looked super shitty, super old, super outdated. It made me feel cool. It made me feel like I had like a $20,000 Omega on my wrist, right? And that's kind of when the hobby started, the movement started getting some problems, whatever. I would open up the case, I would try to figure out what's wrong. I would look at the movement, and I was really, really intrigued and interested by how automatic watches could run for like 5 years by themselves. It's all mechanical movement. It's just gears turning and hitting each other and sparking other movements, and there's a spring, so that's the fuel of the watch. But then I'm like, how can a spring, provide so much momentum and keep accuracy and all this stuff? So I was very into that. And I'm like, what's the fuel? Most mechanical machines need fuel. One could say, oh, it's the mainspring, whatever. But mainspring isn't like gasoline. It isn't like oil, It isn't like quartz batteries. So that's what got me into it. And then I started, going from there. Then I got a vintage Rolex Oyster Precision, and then I got, a whole bunch of other different watches, and the collection kept on growing. But I want to say that when I got my first vintage Rolex, that's when things just clicked for me. It's a manual wind Rolex, and I love it. I love every single bit of that watch. I got a good deal on it. It came with the original bracelet. Just a fantastic watch, fantastic price that I paid for it. And having that Rolex on my wrist, yes, it is a vintage Rolex, and people don't give a shit about watches anymore, but it makes me feel like I'm wearing a $30,000 watch. It makes me feel like James Bond. It makes me feel cool. It makes me feel classy. It makes me feel sophisticated. Like, to other people, they probably don't care. They may think it looks nerdy. They may think like, oh, who wears wristwatches anymore? You freaking geek, whatever. But to me, it's like, it's not just a wristwatch. It's a Rolex. It has history. It has more history than those freaking new people claiming all these Apple watches and, oh yeah, technology. Who needs watches anymore? Watches are older than, they're very old. They're a very sort of, I don't want to say, I could say ancient, because it was a very old thought process on how to keep time. How do we track time? How do we track the phases that go by in each stage of the day, right? You had sundials, and the Egyptians had their different ways of telling time. But sooner or later people thought about, like, oh, how could we tell time in a portable fashion? How could we tell time while we're out in the field? How can we tell time, without looking at the sun, without looking at, the positions of the days or whatever, So to me, that's very interesting. The whole history behind it, and the whole urge for human beings to track and calculate the movement of time is very interesting to me. And how it could be done on this watch is older than I am, and it's still working pristine. Like I said, I got this watch in pristine condition, so it's running really well. But even like vintage watches, they may be a minute or two off, or maybe a minute or two slow, maybe a minute or two fast, whatever. They might have their problems, but still, for 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years of non-stop ticking, that those watches weren't serviced every 5 years. That. Like, if somebody really truly cared about their watches, yeah, they probably got it serviced every maybe 5 to 10 years. But most of the watches out there in the vintage watch market, people just bought it and wore it. They didn't service it. They didn't think about any of that stuff, And they got bored of it, threw it in a corner somewhere, and, years later, somebody like me, many years later, somebody like me buys it, shakes it, it still works, The automatic movement still works, and to me, that's interesting. And even movements that haven't been serviced and used the whole time, like 20, 30 years on the wrist, never serviced, maybe minor adjustments here and there, and it's still ticking, it's still working. To me, 24 hours, 7 days a week, for all those years, to me, that is spectacular. Like, you could think of a car, oh yeah, there's old cars, yeah, but cars don't run 24 hours, 7 days a week. Radios don't run 24 hours, 7 days a week. TVs, all this stuff. To me, I can't think of anything else that